without further ado, Dr. Energia.
Thanks, man. That was a significant bit of ado. Let's see if this works. Sweet, it works. Yeah, I'm Travis. I work for Kaiser. So if you've ever, they said there's a lot of things that are my fault. Yeah, if you've ever cursed the Kaiser standards, then here I am. It's get my card. I didn't bring cards. So tonight we're going to talk about this crazy idea of net zero hospitals. That's what I'll do, kind of the first chunk of this presentation on. Then the second chunk is I'll give you sort of all the news that's fit to print and maybe some other news that's related to ASHRAE Standard 170, ventilation for healthcare. I sit in on those SSPC 170 meetings, however often they happen. So we're in California, and our election is over, and it's fair to say that we're likely going to see a continuation of Governor Brown's policies, at least as it comes to climate and energy. His parting gift to us in the building industry was a commitment that California is going to be zero carbon by 2045 as a state. And so it's an aggressive policy, particularly for the states. And we're already seeing effects of this. You might not have seen this news, but if you work in an office building in Sacramento, then you definitely notice this news. If you are working in healthcare, then you probably know that next year, starting in next year's code, hospitals are no longer categorically exempt from Title 24. Us hospitals have lived in this weird vacuum for the last 30 years where we were exempt from Title 24, and that era is over. So starting next year, hospital energy is regulated in California, and we've got a little bit of ground to make up. It's not as scary as it sounds because hospital energy regulation happens in other places. In particular, the European Union has the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. So they're talking about net zero buildings by, I think it's 2020 or 2025, and then 2045 or 2050 for existing buildings to get into net zero. And hospitals are not exempt from those mandates. The UK has kind of its own set of rules. I don't think they're technically under the EBPD since they Brexited, but they have their own directive that they're going to be carbon neutral with new facilities on new sites starting next year. So 30 days from now, the UK will be opening carbon zero hospitals. Carbon's a little bit different. I think that's a lower bar, but still, this is upon the Europeans essentially right now. ASHRAE does have a cooperation with the European engineers. REVA is the Federation of European Heating and Ventilation Engineers. And last year, ASHRAE cooperated with them to publish a journal full of stories about net zero hospitals. And then ASHRAE and REVA have co-sponsored a net zero guidebook, a net zero hospital guidebook that's just coming together. There's some preliminary stuff together that'll probably be put together over the next year or year and a half. So that'll be something, within ASHRAE, in the ASHRAE bookstore, coming soon. It's kind of fun working with the Europeans because they do things in their standard. We get to see their standards, and they do things with their standards that would make most people in this room freak out. You can't do a patient room with no minimum air changes and natural ventilation. They're like, we do that, all the time. That's basically the way that they do stuff. And so it is interesting to have that cross-pollination going on. It's kind of eye-opening. But the Europeans are on this. Their targets are, a month away or a year away, 18 months away at best. And so it's a good opportunity for us to do some cross-pollination, try to get some learning done. In the U.S., there's a pretty strong pull for net zero, for carbon neutrality. Carbon is a big conversation in healthcare. Climate change is a big conversation in healthcare. Climate resiliency is a huge conversation in healthcare. Whether or not you're a believer in climate change, you certainly want to know what your game plan is for the next round of fires next year. And so we're having that conversation on a very real basis. This group is the Healthcare Climate Council. This is a national group organized by Practice Green Health and Healthcare Without Harm. And you can kind of see, particularly for folks in the California market, there's some big players on the list, between Kaiser and Providence St. Joseph's and the University of California. There's an active interest in climate solutions and having our buildings be positive examples of those things. So let's talk about net zero, kind of practically speaking. If you're doing building energy, what does that really mean? What kind of targets should we really be talking about? About 8 years ago, the University of Washington came out with this study called Targeting 100. And their idea was that we should try to get U.S. hospitals down to an energy use index of 100 kBTU per square foot per year. By the way, that's the units for building energy we use is kBTU per square foot per year. We call it EUI, energy use index, or energy use intensity, whichever you prefer. My super scientific net zero target is a little bit lower than that. It's about 70, and I will talk you through my highly, very pinpoint logic that I've used to arrive at that target. If you sort of take our average medical center site acreage and square footage of build out, you call that development density, and then you look at landing 10 to 15% of that site, covering 10 to 15% of that site with solar panels, then you'd wind up with a production capability between 40 and 110 kBTU per square foot per year. So bada boom, bada bing. We should point at about 70. That's where I get at that number. But honestly, whether you point at 70 or 100 is kind of a moot point because of where we're at now. The average U.S. hospital uses 230 kBTU per square foot per year, and depending on which set of numbers you look at, it's 230 to 250. So we're using 5 times the energy of a lot of the rest of the commercial building portfolio. These are the CBEX numbers, and then there's other numbers out there. The Energy Star has some numbers, and then there's an independent hospital energy benchmarking study done by a consulting group that has about 200 hospitals in it. But the bottom line is, if you have a U.S. hospital and you're under about 200 kBTU per square foot per year, then you're doing very, very well. And I say that so that I can brag on the next slide by showing you these are Kaiser's top 10 hospitals, and you can kind of see that our lowest is down at the 150, 160 range, but very, very quickly we get up to 200 kBTU a square foot a year. And I kind of need to make it my business to know where the rest of the leaders are in North America, at least. And to my knowledge, there's nobody that's beat 150 in the U.S. or Canada. I know there's some hospitals that have designed to 100 and have had energy models for 100, but they come in at 160 or 170. And I do know at least 2 facilities that are pretty close to that mark. They're in the 160s. But I don't think that there is a hospital in North America that's beat 150 or gotten to 150 yet. And then this is Europe. And the short version of what's going on in Europe is that they're kicking our butts. The Targeting 100 group actually set that target of 100 based on some of the European benchmarking that they did. Scandinavia, in particular, they were looking at Denmark and Scandinavia and found hospitals that were right around 100 kBTU a square foot a year. Germany published their data at the end of last year, and they're at 85 right now. So they're essentially ready for the net zero targets to hit them, in a year or a year and a half. They're in reasonable shape for that. The good news is that Canada is right there with us, man. So that makes it fun. So here's the quick 411 on how we use energy in U.S. hospitals. It's actually pretty simple. About 10% of our energy goes to lighting, and then another 15 to 20% of our energy goes to everything else that's plugged in throughout the entire building. And then the rest goes to HVAC. So 2/3 to 3/4 of our energy goes to HVAC, which if you've never heard that statistic before, sounds odd because you think of hospitals are really energy intense buildings, and you want to say, well, that's because we have all this medical equipment plugged into the wall. And no, that's not the case. It all goes to the air conditioning. And it's hard to overstate how outrageous our HVAC energy is. If you were to build a 200-bed luxury hotel and then build a 200-bed hospital right next to it that's exactly the same size, the HVAC systems in the hospital would use 5 times the annual energy of the HVAC systems in the hotel. So it's not like we're off by 20% or 30%, we're off by 500%. And we know why. Because the hotel would not design its system using a table of mandatory minimum air change rates for all the spaces. They would design the spaces to be comfortable, and they would design the spaces to have good air quality. They would design the spaces to control odors, but we do this. We do this mandatory minimum air change rates. We've been doing this for 50 years, and so we're going to need to have a conversation about this as an industry, and that's actually started about 5 years ago, but we're going to need to keep having that conversation. And just to hammer the point home, when I talk about an energy target of 70, we're using that amount of energy in reheat alone in U.S. hospitals. So we have central systems, and we run the fans all the time, and then we run the cooling all the time, and then we run the reheat all the time. And that reheat energy is the single biggest component of our energy. So it's pure energy waste. So if you want to feel this in your heart, you go to your nearest hospital on a 110-degree day in the summertime, and you find the boilers running at full blast. We pump heat into our buildings all summer long. We spend enough energy to run a German hospital on reheat alone in U.S. hospitals. So that's kind of where we're at. It's a good starting point, at least. So what are we going to do? How are we going to approach this net zero thing? Obviously, we're going to do on-site generation, right? And we're not going to have a microgrid conversation here tonight. We could talk all day about microgrids, and I have talked all day about microgrids. But I'm just showing the slide to make sure that you get the idea that if we're solving an energy problem in hospitals, we're not going to do that independent of the source problem. So while we're thinking about demand reduction in the hospital, we're also going to be thinking about on-site production, on-site electrical storage, which is now economically viable. We're also going to be talking about carbon-free heating. That's a big conversation in Europe, but the whole idea of how are we going to produce heat into our buildings without burning fossil fuel, without burning natural gas. And then, of course, thermal storage. Don't forget about thermal storage, right? That's still going to be part of the equation in order to get to this. The idea is if we solve both of these equations simultaneously, then we kind of will get to this holy grail of grid independence, or at least the ability to do some functionality on grid independence. Which is really important because that leads back into that climate resiliency thing, right? When the fires happen or whatever the effects are, we can operate critical functions independent of the grid. So I know you're all ASHRAE people, and so I have already read your minds and I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, hey, we should do heat recovery chillers, or chiller optimization, or variable volume pumping, or cogeneration, or trigen, or maybe you should try thermal fluid heaters, or all these things, right? All these things that you're thinking about, these fantastic system options and central plant ideas that we can use to reduce our energy signature. And I want to let you know, we're doing all of that. And we're not working with dummies, at least most of the time we're not working with dummies. But so we've deployed all of these technologies out into the portfolio, and the results are what the results are, right? We still don't have a building that's under 150. So the 2 points that I would give you on that, first off, is as an industry, HVAC, we need to be very much in the results business with our energy promises. If you sat in the tech session, you know that I'm pretty passionate about data. So the rule with energy technologies is, in my book, energy savings didn't happen unless it happened on the bills. If it didn't happen on the bills, it didn't happen. And that's kind of all there is to it. We've had a lot of HVAC technology that overpromises and underdelivers. The heat recovery chillers, by the way, we have, I think, 2 facilities with heat recovery chillers, and one of them made the top 10 list, then the other one didn't, right? Cogeneration, trigeneration, same sort of thing. Some of those guys made the top 10 list. Others did not make the top 10 list. We have a chilled beam hospital, and it's not on the top 10 list. It made the top 15, but it didn't make the top 10. So we've got to be real diligent about making promises and then following those through and making sure that what we promise comes true. And the second thing is, I just don't fundamentally believe that there is a central plant option that's going to kind of magically get us to the point that we need to get to. We have to talk about demand reduction. We have to talk about being smart in the facility and reducing how we're using energy. And so we're going to talk about that. Here's kind of the good news slide. And this is our medical office buildings or clinical buildings. What we did with medical office buildings is we established an energy target back in 2012. We started having our engineers design to that energy target, and we measured the consumption of all those buildings as they opened. And the strategy, by the way, here for later in the conversation is we do not use air change tables in our medical office buildings. We just outright don't do them. We told the engineers, if you're not required to use an air change table by law, then don't do it. And so we just simply stopped doing it. And I'm happy to report that from the buildings that we were opening sort of 2012 and prior to the buildings that we've opened in the last 2 years, we've seen a full 50% energy reduction, from 140 down to 70. There was a learning curve in order to get down to that number, but we have been able to kind of achieve that. So that's the good news side of the story. The bad news side of the story is the energy target we set was 50, and the energy models that we were getting were coming in at 35 and 40, and we're sitting at 70. So again, we've got a long ways to go in terms of delivering on the promises that we're coming up with. And that means we got to do more. We got to do more honest energy models. We got to do a better job of actually producing energy predictions. We got to do a better job of commissioning. We got to do a better job of validation and making sure that our promises come true. Kind of all of that together. So I'm going to talk about the Pareto Principle. The European Union, by the way, I love that they call it the Pareto Principle, or that they say. The guide for net zero says you should do a Pareto analysis, which sounds really fancy for the 80-20 rule. So I kind of enjoy that. So anyway, this is our Fontana Medical Center, 2.2 million square feet of facility. And you can't read it, but what's up there is a list of those spaces by square footage in the facility. And if you sort of take that list and you understand that, every air change that I do has an energy cost associated to that, based on Los Angeles weather data, and sort of apply that back to the square footages and resort everything by energy to see, okay, where am I actually using energy in the average medical center or in this Fontana Medical Center, and sort of come back and you come up with this list. The 80-20 rule says that where we should be focusing most of our effort here, in order to get to 80% of the energy intensity at this facility, we're talking admin, office, corridor, vestibule, stairs, lobbies, workrooms, staff rooms, storage and equipment rooms, toilet rooms, restrooms, and then diagnostic and treatment, and you're done with the 80-20 rule. Patient rooms don't even make it into the 80-20 rule on a hospital. When we talk about hospital energy, everybody wants to talk about ORs. ORs are way the hell down the list, because in a 2.2 million square foot campus, if we have 1,600 square foot of ORs, it doesn't matter if the energy intensity of the OR is 1,000 times everything else. They're way down on the list on the overall. And isolation rooms are the same story. They're way down on the list. So we need to hit the common areas, and we need to hit those areas really hard. Now, the good news for those of us, we're all in California, is that the new OSPOD code that comes out next year creates a whole bunch of opportunities here. Admin spaces and offices used to require 4 air changes per hour. Those have been completely removed from Table 4A. And so now the minimum is go ahead and use Standard 62 whenever you want to. Waiting rooms in the new version of the OSPOD code, it used to say 12 air changes per hour for all waiting rooms, and now they've followed ASHRAE, and so it's only the ER waiting room and the radiology waiting room. The rest of them go back to Standard 62. Patient rooms have come down from 6 air changes to 4 air changes. Corridors are down to 2 air changes. So there's big opportunities that come in sort of with every code cycle, and the ASHRAE thing is the same. There's reductions going on with the different versions. The bad news is that in California, OSPOD is not. We'll say they're not the friendliest environment to VAV systems. Adoption of VAV systems has been a little more difficult here than it is in the other 49 states. But that's certainly not a barrier that should stop us from doing all this stuff. And we're working with ASHRAE real close on that on a lot of projects. So we got to start dragging these things down. And what it takes is this sort of time and care. What I'm having my engineers do now is, every time we do an air handler project, we're looking at all the rooms, and it's like you need to maximize those VAV opportunities at every room, unoccupied turndowns, and what are the real minimums that you need in that space. It takes that room by room level. Treat every CFM that you're applying to the space with, or the way that we've talked about it before is stop thinking of air in terms of cubic feet per minute and start thinking of air in terms of cubic feet per year. And once you make that transition, then it's like, okay, I get it. Toilet rooms are going to be unoccupied. Even if you assume that toilet rooms are occupied 4 hours a day, that means they're empty 20 hours a day. And so ventilating those all the time, if you move that into units of cubic feet per year, then you get it, right? There's a ton of energy that just goes out. So that's how we're going to do it. It's I believe the solution here is basic blocking and tackling. We're going to have smart central plants, but the basic blocking and tackling is that you got to apply your air system smartly, do as much VAV as you can everywhere you can, to as much reduction as you possibly can, and I think we